Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into another Caldera Intel series. I'm Grandmaster Gojj, and in this video, we're going to be breaking down Peak. Now, Peak is one of the hottest drops in the game based on everything I'm seeing right now. Again, we're only about 3 or 4 days in at this point, so it could change. But as I was trying to make this video on Peak, I found a lot of interesting things about this location. So let's jump straight into it. Now, I didn't take a Jeep through this location like I have on the other videos for pretty obvious reasons. Number one, I gotta tell you guys about how to drop Peak because there's a very specific way to do it. And I gotta say, there was multiple maps I was dropping in where I thought I could stretch to Peak and I couldn't. The elevation change on this map is actually quite dramatic, especially in the center of the map. And so oftentimes as I'm floating along, I'm either getting shot out of the air by some hyper aggressive clown, or I can't quite make it. I can't quite stretch that far. I finally got some pretty good plane lines that went over the top of Peak, and let me just tell you, Peak is a hot drop. If there's a line that comes somewhat close to the center of the map, you bet your butt there are so many people that are going to drop there, specifically full squads. If you're playing quads, a lot of teams of 4 like to drop on this location, and just about everyone drops on what I call the 3 circles: the small, medium, and large, or the bottom, middle, and top circle, however you want to describe them. It kind of is the designation of the one major building that then expands into the tons of tunnels and everything that is inside of Peak. Now, not only is this a hot drop, as you can see from some of the footage here, but there's also just a random side note. There is a ton of these red canisters, and yes, you can pick them up and you can throw them. You can light this fuse and toss them across and they'll eventually blow up almost like a frag grenade. They have a timer on them. Also, be careful with these red canisters because if you're holding one and somebody shoots you in the chest and you're holding it in front of you, it will blow up. So again, pick it up and toss it. Hey, really quick, sorry to cut myself off, whatever. If you could subscribe to the channel and like the video, that would mean the world to me. All right, get back to it. Let's go. All right, so I'm dropping onto Peak, and this line was actually fairly close to the Peak. It wasn't directly over it, which is where I found a lot of these hot drops happening. And so in this clip, I barely make it to the smallest portion or the furthest south portion of these circles, or whatever you want to call them, the large building here in Peak. And I find a ton of loot. Also, no one else dropped with me for like the first time after like 13 or 15 takes of me dropping Peak over and over again. This is a very, very slow drop. So what this will actually allow me to do is walk through the entirety of Peak and show you every single region throughout this whole area. And there's a lot. I think at the end of this clip, or at the end of this video, I ended up coming away with somewhere around like $30,000, something like that, after looting the entire thing. My teammates were also around looting, so it's not like everyone together had 30. Like, I personally had 30k, and this is one of the reasons that Peak is such a valuable drop. There's so much loot. You can see I'm picking up orange boxes with satchels. There's a ton of boxes all around the top of these buildings, which is why it makes for a really easy and kind of open drop for a lot of people. You have pretty obvious sight lines. If you're landing on top of this building, you can kind of hide from the other players that tend to drop down into the center of the actual Peak and the kind of mine that's underneath, not to be confused with mines, which is a different location we'll talk about later. So anyways, I find a ton of loot here: precisions, guns, all that good stuff. So one of the notable things about this area is that on the large circle, or the northern circle, there's actually a jump down, and this is one of the more open areas inside of this building, or the circles that I call them, at Peak. You can land on the large circle, grab your guns, and if you don't see enemies up top or you don't want to engage with them, you can immediately drop down into this lower circle, and there's a ton more loot down here. I've actually seen a lot of people actually land here, which I don't think is a bad strategy if you're not trying to die off the rip or land super hot. I mean, think of this as the new hospital, in my opinion. I mean, this is the place people are going to drop for high intensive skirmishes, especially at the beginning of the life cycle of this game. It might shift down the road, but right now I'm finding more hot drops here than almost anywhere, of course, depending on the line, because again, you can't reach this location every single time. There's actually a gondola system that goes down to the south side of the map. It's really like southwest side of the map from the Peak region. The gondolas are fairly lengthy and not really worth touching unless you really need to get somewhere. You can just about fly all the way with your parachute, by the way, down there. So it's like, don't ride them unless you're just trying not to get shot out of the air, and just go prone on them and hide. But the next thing that you got to know is under each of these circles, there is a ladder / a hole to get down into this kind of like underground system. And this isn't even really underground yet. We will get underground, trust me. This is this kind of bunker system that's built into this building structure that sits on top of the Peak. And yes, the Peak is a mine. Remember that. There are a ton of boxes in here. When I say a ton, I mean, just watch the video. There are a ton. I mean, box after box after box in these hallways, and it can get a little bit confusing. There's also, this is one of the mine shafts down, and this actually is our first entrance to the outside. So theoretically, if you didn't want to land on top of the building, or maybe you didn't make it, if you land on this side of the small circle, there's actually double doors. You can go up the ladder, and now you're into the kind of like corridor system underneath the top where most people are dropping. So again, there is a ladder and a hole on the small circle, on the middle circle, and then you have the big drop off on the other side of the big circle at the top. Okay. There's also a zip line on the outside if you need to get up on the outside. If you need to get to the big circle side into this small or this larger open cavern, you can crawl along that ledge and sneak back through, and now you're back into the systems. There is a passageway that takes you straight to the center of the peak, and this is a lot of the surface area of the peak, and I've almost always seen a buy station sitting at this exact spot every single map I dropped, and I dropped peak legitimately 15 times in a row. So great place to drop because of that as well. Now, again, you can't buy loadout off the rip, but you can buy a ton of UAVs, which will help you in your fights. Now, in this area, there's not a lot of loot scattered on the surface of this kind of mine structure here that's at the top of the peak, but there is a ginormous hole in the center. Also, this really cool little river thing. It doesn't do anything, but it looks cool. There's a ginormous hole here that drops down into another series, and these are actually caverns, not just kind of corridors that are built in. This seems more natural, or like it was mined out, which I'll show you now. So there are 2 zip lines that take you up or theoretically down, but you can just jump down here. And there is a little bit of loot scattered around here, but this isn't like the perfect place to loot. Like, you don't want to land dead center and try to loot up this area. I've rarely found more than like a gun or two and a couple $1,000 max. But there are some really cool water structures down here, and you'll actually see later there's a random geyser that pops up and kind of scares you. But these cool little waterfall drips, it make for a really cool experience. This is actually one of my favorite spots on the map, just from aesthetic alone, not even loot. So this corridor will take you down to the other side of the map, and you can see it on your mini map here that I'm showing now. The west side of the map comes through this corridor, and there's actually a number of different corridors to take you to the west and then also take you to the east. So this is another entrance, and this one's a interesting one. I wouldn't recommend dropping, hey, let's drop at this entrance on the map, which you can see is right at the end of the 2 roads on the west side of the peak region where the 2 roads end. That's the entrance into the mine shaft, which will take you to the center, which you can then zip up. I hate zip lines, especially on a hot drop like this, so it's not really worth landing on the outside and then moving your way in unless it's like a third-party situation and you're, you know, halfway through the game or near the end circle and it's ending on peak. This is a good way to enter into peak without going all the way. There's that geyser I mentioned. So this other corridor is a little bit smaller, a little bit more compact, and it takes you to the east side of peak. And this will take you actually underneath the large building that we were going through earlier, right? And this one's pretty small, has some guns, actually quite a bit of guns on this drop. I didn't see this many every single time, but you will find some loot down here. And again, this is another way you can exit or enter into the other side of peak on kind of the ground level without having to clamber rocks, because we all know clambering rocks in this game is super frustrating, although it is a little bit better on this map than Verdansk in my opinion. But again, this is one of the other corridors that will take you to the other side, but there is also a stairway that'll take you back into the corridors we were exploring earlier. This is where the zip line, we looked down the zip line earlier in the video. This is where the zip line takes you back up. You can then travel through that corridor and back up to the top of the actual structure. There's also these pretty interesting, like, cool AAGuns that don't do anything on the outside. And there's actually about 4 or 5 boxes over on this side as well. Again, peak is riddled with loot. Remember that. Also, right here, occasionally you'll find these glitched boxes around the map, just in general, not even here at peak. If you ever need to open them and you can't open them, just go prone and it'll open them for you. So you can take this cart pathway back into the corridors of this kind of mine peak area. You can go back down where we're at, or you take the zip line up. This will take you back near the top of the building, and now you're back at the structure. This is dead center, by the way, of the buildings on that middle circle or the medium circle. And here's the ladder that you would drop down on. Boom. Now you're back to where we started. So really cool area. So many different pathways. So many, honestly, there's a lot of outplay potential on peaks. And this is why it's one of my favorite places to drop and one of my favorite places to fight. Now, I gotta say, I hate traveling up to peak. So dropping here is great, but if you've got to go here later into the game, it can get extremely frustrating trying to clamber all the rocks or just basically run straight up a mountain. So I get that, but if you want to drop here, that's fantastic. Basically, if you're ever looking for a way to get up peak and you can't clamber the rocks, go to one of those openings I mentioned, right? On the east or west side where the AAGuns, where those two roads meet, that's a way to get into the map and the terrain kind of levels out. And then also on the east side. The other thing about this map that you got to remember too is if you land peaks first, loot up really quickly, get all your money, get UAVs going, and obviously you're gonna find some good guns eventually at peak, you can actually basically fly anywhere on the map from peak. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but like not really. Because there was so much of this video, I kind of forgot about the favorite drop spot, least favorite drop spot, and my best rotation. Again, peak is pretty crazy, but here it is very quickly. My favorite drop is got to be the rooftops of the buildings, or the top of the buildings that we mentioned. Probably I like to land one of the outer circles, either short circle or small circle or large circle, because if you land in the middle, you're probably going to get third party, especially if it's pretty hot. I kind of like the large circle because it gives you another option to drop down below if you're kind of in trouble. So that's probably my favorite drop. My least favorite drop is definitely landing dead center of peak and dropping straight into the mines. It doesn't make for a very exciting game, and to be honest, the loot's better inside the actual building structure, so don't necessarily go down there immediately. My favorite rotation, land on top of the roof, loot up like crazy, kill anybody you need to, run through the actual building itself. You now have an absolute metric shit ton of money. You don't need to really go anywhere else in peaks unless there's a ton of teams here that looted up and left. So grab all that money and then leave. Go somewhere else. Go center of zone and go get busy. This is the place you need to go if you're trying to get a lot of kills. So buy your UAVs, use your ground loot, and go get a ton of kills before you go pick up your loadout elsewhere. Of course, you can go anywhere on the map depending on where the circle is. Go towards people, use those UAVs. That's all I've got. I'll see you guys in the next video.